Okay, before going any further, let's save our work. The way Unity breaks up an application is what's known as scenes. So a title screen would be a scene. A level, like in a side-scrolling game, would be a scene. So level 1 would be a scene, level 2 would be a scene. In, say, a survival horror game, an old-style one where you'd walk through a door and the game would load, and then you have a couple rooms, you walk through another door and game loads again. Well, that area between doors, that would be a scene. So a collection of like rooms where it doesn't have to load everything that's loaded at one time, that would be a scene. In open world games, you tend not to have scenes per se because you kind of have this constant influx of assets being loaded and other assets being purged. But in a game like this, we're only going to have like 2 or 3 scenes. Okay, so let's go to File, Save Scene. Since it doesn't have a title, it'll bring up the Save As. And we can just call this Scene 1. In your game, particularly if you're making a more complicated one, a more complex one, you're going to want to name it more descriptively. So like the title menu would be, say, Title Scene. Ending credits would be that, that kind of thing. So let's save that. As you can see down here, this icon, this tells you that's a scene. So if we have multiple scenes, you have to make sure that you click on the right one and that you're working on that scene. Okay, so let's now add the clickability to the 3 choice objects. Now, I probably should have done this before, but like I said, I didn't want to do too much in the first video. So before I duplicated it, I really should have added what's known as a collider box. Having said that, you can add a component to multiple objects at the same time. So 6 one way, 1/2 dozen the other. You can either create you can add the component first and then duplicate the object, or if you've duplicated the object, you can simply highlight them all and add it at the same time. So I've highlighted all 3. I'm going to click on Add Component. I'm going to click on Physics 2D. I'm going to click on Box Collider 2D. See these squares? These are the borders of the collider. So all the area inside is where a collision occurs. Now, because there is no sprite image yet, okay, there's no default image, it uses this default size. If there were an image there, then it would fit automatically to the size of the image. Now, having said that, we'll probably have to tweak the size of these when we see how the image looks, or else what would happen is the image is going to be out here, and you'll have this kind of dead space where people can click, and it won't work. So just giving you a heads up, we'll probably modify the size of these in a bit. Okay, so they all have a collider box. See this is trigger? You want to click on that. So what does that do? If you add a collider box but you don't set it as a trigger, you've basically made that object solid. Like think about 2 cars colliding. They're solid. They're going to like bounce off each other, or they're going to stop in front of each other, but they don't pass through each other per se. Now, why would you want a collider that's a trigger? Well, there's a couple reasons. Say you have a character and it's a top-down view game, and that character walks over a trap door. Well, you need to detect the collision with the trap door, but they still also need to be able to walk onto it before something happens. You don't want something to happen the moment they brush up against the edge of it. So that's just one example where you want a collision to occur, but you don't want to stop the player from moving. Another example may be in a game 2D or 3D where there's like a mist, and maybe the mist is like a poison. Well, again, the person can walk through it. You don't want to stop them, but you do want that detection to be, you want that collision to be detected so you can say, okay, there's damage over time now. So sometimes you want to trigger, sometimes you don't. In this case, you want to trigger because it needs to be able to detect the mouse click. So now if you click on these individually, you'll see that there's the box collider trigger, box collider trigger, box collider trigger. And as we said in the previous video, we attached this script. And in this script is where we have to check for the mouse click. So Since the script is attached to every object, we only have to do the code once, and the script will apply it to every object that the script is attached to, just as we only wrote this out once, but it added variables to every object, all three objects that the script was attached to. So, what we want to do is we need to add a section outside of start, outside of update. It's called void on mouse down. And it's important to note, sorry about that, it is case sensitive. So the O, M, and D all have to be capitalized. All the other letters have to be lowercase, no spaces, no underscores. This is a predefined routine. So if you change even one letter, it's not going to function right. You're actually, just as this says start and this says update, for this to work, it has to be on mouse down. As you can see, the other aspects are the same. You have the parentheses, and then you have the brackets surrounding everything going on in that area. So on mouse down. What we're going to do is first, and I strongly suggest this, whenever you're adding new functionality, particularly collisions, you want to make sure that works because it can fail in so many different ways. And I don't mean that to discourage you. I just mean, like I said, this is case sensitive. So a single wrong letter and it won't work. So you want to make sure that this is working before you start getting complex functionality in here. So there's something known as the console. It's actually this space down here, okay? You can put debug log information into the console. So debug.log, and we want something to be put in here. Well, since this script is attached to three different objects, we can't just say it works. We want to make sure it works on all of them. So there's a way of grabbing the name of the object, okay, and having it print into the debug log. And that is so gameObject.name. So what this is saying is the object that this script is attached to. If you click the mouse on it, then print the name of that object. So that one line of code will work for every single object you have attached it to. So unless I've made a mistake, watch what happens. Actually, because this doesn't have an image yet, it's a little hard to tell where everything is. So for the moment, I'm going to put a default image here, or else I'm going to be kind of clicking around crazy. So let's take the B, and we'll make that B. There we go. So now that we've done that, we can now modify the size of these squares to make them more appropriate. So here's the size, 1x and 1y. So y is the horizontal size, x, my apologies. X is the horizontal size, y is the vertical size. So let's make it 2 by 2. Not quite. Let's try 2.5 by 2.5. That actually looks pretty good. Now what we can do is we can just separate these a little bit. Okay, so now they all have collider boxes. They're all set to triggers. The script is attached to all of them. So if I click on them, the name of the object I'm clicking on should appear down here. See, choice 1, choice 2, choice 3. Great. Now, actually, what I'm going to do is, like I said at the beginning, it really doesn't matter how you line them up other than how you want this to visually look. And I'm thinking I want the bottom to have like menu options, such as maybe a message that says correct or incorrect or something like that. But again, the layout on the screen does not change the functionality. It'll work exactly the same way if you want to lay it out like this. Watch. Choice 1, choice 2, choice 3. It showed correctly every time. And we'll just slide them all over. Okay, so clicking on them works. Now, this actually gives us a leg up on something else that we need to do. We obviously need to make sure that we're clicking on the right object. So we're always going to have, one of the things we're going to do is track which object should be the right one to click on, and then we have to compare it to the one that is being clicked on. So this actually kind of gives us a leg up. We already know how to capture the name of the one that we're clicking on. So what we now need to do is we now need to be able to find a way of cycling through questions here. So just as we put the word test here, okay, this portion, so this aspect, this attribute of this component can actually be modified with a script. And so you can change this to predetermined values. So you can change it to bee or burger or cactus or cake. And then you will separately have to track which one is the right one to be clicked on. So how do we do that? We need to use something that's known as a list variable. Now, so far we've seen sprite variables that store a single value. A list variable is different. A list variable, you can predefine dozens or even hundreds of values ahead of time. And the reason why you would do that is you'd use one list that says, okay, what's the different values that are going to be up here? And then another list would say, okay, which one of the choices is going to be the correct one? So, what does that look like? Well, this is attached to these objects, so we really don't want to put it in that script. We're really going to create a game master object and attach a script to that. Now, there's nothing magical about a game master object, a GM object. Calling it a game master is really for you, the designer, to say, okay, that's what I'm using this for. It's going to be really a storage area for functionality that isn't necessarily associated with any one object, so much as overall game flow. So game object, create empty. Like I said, we'll call it GM. We're going to create another script. Create C#, and we'll call this game flow. Or gameplay, whatever. Process flow. Just the idea that this isn't really necessarily associated with any one object so much as the game flow in general. Just drag and drop it onto the object that you want it to be attached to. You can also do add component, script, and choose, if you haven't made it yet, okay, you can choose to make a new script, or you can choose to attach a script. So you'll see how this says script and this is a new script. So rather than right-clicking down here, I could have clicked on new script here. So different ways to do the same thing. Now, what we're going to do is we need that to create a list, among other things. We also need it to be aware of this object, because that's one thing about developing in Unity. I have this, I have this, I have the camera, but guess what? None of it is aware of anything else, for want of a better term. I know it makes it sound like I'm talking about AI, but this can't make any changes to this. This can't make any changes to this. You have to create linkages between them, and then you can make changes via script. So we need the GM object to be aware of this test object, text object, this text object, so it can make changes to it. So let's see how that would look. Let's open up game flow. And we're going to create a variable here. So public. Let's do transform. And we'll call this, see, we called it question text as an object, but want to avoid using exactly the same naming. So we'll call it qtest and then obj. That's the naming convention that I like to remind myself that's an object, because what happens is when you're typing out code, it's going to make suggestions. So if you're trying to type out a variable name, it's going to start displaying variable names. And if you've got hundreds and thousands of variables, it gets confusing to know which one does what. So this, by seeing the obj, you remind yourself, oh yeah, that's a game object. So public transfer qtest obj. We'll save this. So we click on GM, the script is attached to it, and there's the object. Or excuse me, there's the variable. So now what you're going to do is you're going to take this object, drag and drop, and put it there. So that's a little bit different than what we did before. Before we created variables and took the images from down here. Here we're taking an actual object that's in the scene and going to manipulate it. So now back to the script, game flow. So we are storing this object in this variable, or should I say we're referencing this object in this variable. And what we're going to do is in the start section, we're going to make a modification. Now this modification is absolutely temporary. It's just to demonstrate a couple ideas. One, how to modify an attribute of an object, and two, how to modify an attribute of an object that's being stored in a variable or being referenced by a variable. So, if I was to type out get component, it does exactly what it's saying. It's getting a component. These here, if I didn't mention it earlier, these are components. So transform is a component. Game flow is a component. Well, I don't want to modify a component of this. I want to modify a component of this, okay, which is stored here. So what I want to do is I want to preface this with that variable. So now I'm saying I'm not saying get a component of the object the script is attached to. I'm saying get a component of this variable, and this variable again stores that, references that. So get component. Yes, that's a less than sign, but it's not being used as a less than sign. It's going to be used like a parenthesis, as you'll see in a minute. So what component? Well, we said we want to get the text mesh component. So text mesh component, then the greater than sign. Again, yes, it's the less than and greater than sign, but it's being used kind of like parentheses. And then we said we want to get the text attribute, and we want to set it to something. This is temporary. We really don't want it to say B, okay? But what we do want to do is in the next variable, we're going to go through creating the list and randomization and dropping those values into this variable. But I just want to show you ahead of time how to do this. I just want to show just the idea of linking objects and then modifying one with a script attached to the other. See, so now it says B. So this really doesn't have any correlation with this yet. So that's what we're going to do in the next video. We're going to create the variable that gives this all its values, and then we're going to create the variable that says, okay, show the corresponding pictures and which one is going to be the predetermined one to be correct. So that should do it for this video. And like I said, that's what we're going to do in the next one.